למרצה הבא, עמי מטלון, יש חשיבות מיוחדת עבורנו. עמי לימד כיתות מחוננים רבות, ובפרט את הכיתה שלנו במשך שנתיים. הוא לימד אותנו איך לחשוב מחוץ לקופסה ואיך להביע את עצמנו בדרכים יצירתיות.
First of all, I'd like to apologize for delivering this talk in English, but I think that about halfway through my talk, you're going to understand why I made this stupid decision and set myself up for a possible failure. My name is Ami and I'm a teacher. I've been teaching in the public education system for the past decade or so, and it has been the second of 3 significant and separate time periods I spent in this education system. First of which was back in the 1980s, when I was still a student. Cute, eh? And the third and most recent one, as a father of 4 even cuter children who are struggling through different phases of their formal education right now. And although each time I spent in the education system was completely different, both in terms of the time and the location in which it took place, and in terms of my own perspective and experience and point of view, I can still draw 2 very clear lines of similarity between these 3 encounters with this enormous and complicated system. Now, the first one is quite obvious. The system hasn't changed much in the past half-century or so. The classroom that I teach in today is almost identical to the one I attended 30 years ago at my teacher, Mrs. Braff. And it looks exactly like the same classes that my kids attend these days. And I'm not only talking about the familiar configuration of a blackboard, a whiteboard, a teacher standing in front of it, and children sitting at their desks facing him. I'm also talking about the barred windows, the same fluorescent lighting, the same depressing choice of color for the walls every time. In fact, the whole atmosphere of a classroom, which I remember as being dreary and outdated 30 years ago, has basically remained the same. And I'm not talking only about the way things look. If you glance at a high school curriculum from my days at middle school or high school and compare it to the one that I hand out to my students each year, you'll find that the subject matter, the very core of education, has also remained the same. One would assume that with the tremendous progress made by the scientific and technological world over the past few decades, we'd totally transform what we teach our children. But that assumption would unfortunately be wrong. It's enough to point out that the general history curriculum in Israel 2015 ends in 1945, after World War II, as if nothing of historical significance ever happened after that. The second line of resemblance between my 3 experiences in the education system is that every time I spent enough time in the system, I started to experience moments of anger and frustration, during which I wholeheartedly wanted to tear the whole system down. Not fix it, change something, replace someone, but smash it to pieces and start over. Now you saw Sir Ken Robinson, speak before, and in his recent TED Talk, he said that education doesn't need an evolution, but a revolution. And I think he's 100% right. Problem is, statements like this are aimed at policymakers, education ministers, while the single teacher in the field, the single student in the classroom, doesn't feel that he or she has the power to single-handedly revolutionize the system. I know, because I tried, and failed miserably each and every time. And I know I'm not the only one who thinks that way, because I've heard many people, sadly a lot of them teachers, confessing that they had similar moments of frustration. Now you might say, perhaps, these feelings are natural, they're normal. You're facing a huge system, that's on the one side obsolete. As I said, nothing has changed over the past 50 years or so. On the other side is very powerful and overbearing. Maybe it's even a healthy ventilation of emotions. But that would be looking at it from a psychological, individual point of view. And what I want to talk with you about today are the structural and professional implications of this phenomenon, because I genuinely think that we are facing an epidemic of frustration and boredom, and it's devastating to our education. The main problem with it is that every time each of us, a parent, a student, most of all teachers, face a situation like this and realize that he or she can't change the whole system by themselves, it becomes very easy to get discouraged and just give up. And when you do that, when you throw in the virtual towel, you risk losing a lot of your drive and your positive energies. And I've seen this happen to too many good people too many times over the years. So what I want to share with you today is not only a different point of view regarding this problem, but a different course of action, a different approach. One that I've adopted and applied in my classrooms intuitively at first, in order to cope with my own frustration and try and channel it along a more constructive path. And I call this model constructive demolition, as it is based on my experiences from a totally different field. When I graduated from law school, I quickly found that I wasn't able to sit behind a desk in an office all day, so I had to find something else to do. And I became a builder. I went into construction. And my specialty back then was preserving and renovating old buildings from the 1920s and 30s at the heart of Tel Aviv, what's called as the Bauhaus period. I built this too. I really did. Now, this work was very creative and it was out in the open air, so I enjoyed it a lot. But since I had to sell the apartments in order to pay for the project, and earn a living, then I faced the same problem time and time again, which was this. Even though these buildings are beautiful on the outside, the apartments in them were designed 100 years ago. And they simply didn't meet the standards, the needs of current prospective buyers. So we had to come up with creative ideas that would allow us to preserve the exterior while modernizing the interior. And I'll give you a quick example so you understand. Back in the early 20th century, people liked their kitchens to be a separate unit, divided from the rest of the apartment by a door. But these days, people prefer that their kitchens be a part of a larger open space, connected to their dining area, the living room. So we had to sit down with our engineers and find structural solutions that would support the ceiling, and then we could knock down the walls on the inside to create that open space and give the apartment the feel and function that was compatible to today's modern standards. 10 years later, I found my true calling in education. And pretty soon I started experiencing those moments of frustration I was talking about earlier. I felt that the frameworks that the system has put in place were too rigid, and they weren't compatible with the way I perceived my challenges and my goals as a teacher. I actually felt suffocated. I was constrained by the walls of my classroom, by the 45-minute time frame of the lesson, by the subject matter dictated through the official curriculum, and most of all by the countless rules and regulations I had to comply with. And every time I tried to challenge these restrictions, I would get systematically discouraged. The veteran teachers would tell me there's no use to try and fight the system, and that I would fail if I tried to ignite a revolution bottom up. And as I quite honestly admitted here, I did fail. But I found a way around it. Instead of knocking the whole structure down, starting over, I went back to what we did back when I was a builder and tried to find creative ways that would allow me to keep the exterior of rules and regulations and frameworks intact while breaking down the inside of my own space and time, my classes, my lessons, my projects. You know how sometimes in I'm sure parents here would relate to this. Sometimes our kids come up to us and they say they want to make some kind of mess. And you tell them, sure, make a mess, but do it in your own room, not all over the house. So what I did was I started making a mess in my own room. That means my classroom. And in order to succeed in that, I had to let go of old paradigms, things I already took for granted, as did almost everybody around me. And more important than that, I had to prepare myself for multiple failures, because I've never done that before, like I've never given a lecture in English before. I had to adopt what I always told my students and my kids. The only way you won't make a mistake is if you don't even try to begin with. And I forced myself to re-examine the frameworks in which I worked and try to knock as many walls down. First thing I did was eliminate the subject titles from the kids' schedule and replace them with my own name, as you can see from the green squares behind me. And if you ask one of my students, what do you have scheduled for, let's say, second period Sunday, they'll reply they have AMI. Because they know I'm going to be there. They have no idea what we're going to learn or what we're going to do, and most of the time, neither do I. But it keeps me on my toes. It makes me challenge myself every week, trying to come up with something to do. And after I knocked down the walls of the schedule, I turned and tried to do the same thing with the subject matter and the way I taught it. Like when we talked about freedom of expression in class. I took them out, the whole class, to South Tel Aviv to explore underground culture of street art and graffiti and to find out how this thing works. And we came back, I bought some paint, and we practiced it on the walls of our own classroom, inside and out. Now, grant you, we will have to repaint the class at the end of the year. Principal's right here. But throughout the school year, our classroom was unique. It was our own. We owned it. We even set up a small memorial corner for the school uniform that was canceled this year, thank God. Or when I wanted to teach post-Second World War history, simply because I thought it was relevant and important, I deliberately forced myself to step out of my comfort zone and decided I would teach that era through the evolution of rock and roll music. Now I'm passionate about music, but I have no idea how to do that. So I read, and I watched movies, and I met with experts, some of whom I've invited back to lecture in that course. And I found out that rock music was an excellent reflection of all the political and social and even economic processes that went on in the world in the second half of the 20th century. And my students enjoyed studying this, and I was excited and I was challenged, so everybody won. But the best reward you get from knocking down the walls and making a mess in your own room is that your students look up to you and start doing the same. And my favorite example for that happened last year. I was teaching a routine history lesson to the same class that organized this event here today. And maybe there's some connection between the two. When one of my students, Orit, where's her? The pretty girl with the hat, raised her hand and remarked that the political structure I was describing regarding, I don't know, medieval Europe reminded her a lot of the C.S. Lewis's Kingdom of Narnia. And I was surprised. I asked her to elaborate, and she did, and I had to admit she had a valid point, but her hand was still up. And I said, yeah. And she said, can I prepare a lecture for the whole class on Narnia? I was more than happy to oblige. I said, come up to me after class, we'll set up a date. But then another student, Uli, raised his hand and said, well, if she's doing it, can I prepare a lecture on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings? And again, I said, yes. And then another hand was up, and another, and soon enough I had 6 or 7 students jumping in on this initiative. So I said, okay, if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. And we stopped what we were doing, we put medieval Europe aside for a moment, and we spent the rest of that lesson coming up with criteria for this instant research project. And we decided each student could choose a fictional world out of a book or a movie, TV series, even computer, and would study it from 4 different aspects. It's physics, it's geography, it's religion, it's government. in order to determine what makes these worlds so credible to us. And then, of course, come back to the class and share its conclusion with us. This is how the board looked like at the end of that session. And out of the blue, from nowhere, Project History of the Worlds was born. And it became the unexpected highlight of the school year for me. To cut a long story short, we had 20 lectures that year, ranging from Frank Herbert's Dune to SpongeBob's Bikini Bottom, from League of Legends and World of Warcraft to Alice in Wonderland. And we'd wait for 8th period every Monday to hear these lectures. And kids would come from other classes. High school seniors came over just to listen. And it was all initiated by the students. And they were excited about it, and we were engaged in it. They were interested in what we did. And for those of you here who right now think, well, this isn't a proper history lesson, then I must tell you that you don't understand the level of research and the analytical skills required for such an assignment. And more than that, you don't understand the value of passion and motivation to the learning process. And all these examples, they're just a drop in the ocean. Because once you figure out how to make your own private, secret revolution, how to make a mess in your own room without everybody else on the outside noticing, then it becomes easier as you get along. Because your own enthusiasm and your children's engagement create a positive feedback loop that builds up your confidence. And even though not everything works, and I could fill up 3 TED Talks just with ideas that were complete failures, like judo history. That was an awesome failure, but a real thing, I assure you. We tried that for a whole year. You're not discouraged, because they keep filling up your battery with positive energies, with drive. So, in conclusion, I urge each and every one of you, students, parents, most of all teachers, to take the leap, to step out of your comfort zone, to make a mess in your own room. And I promise you, if you adopt this model, make it your own, you might have to work a little harder, but you'll never get bored or frustrated again. Thank you very much.